Chapter 4, page 16, Debts and Threats. As we mentioned in Chapter 2, France lost its North American colonies because of the French and Indian War, but the results of the war didn't end there. How did the war change things in America? The American colonists had helped fight against a common enemy and won. As a result, they would be more united going forward than they had been in the past. The colonies also had military and political leaders for the first time, people like Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. How did the war change things in Britain? The war made King George III realize that he needed to take more control over the colonies, which is why he issued the Proclamation of 1763 after it ended. It cost a lot of money to fight the war. In fact, the amount of money the British government owed in national debt nearly doubled from 1755 to 1764. After the war, the British government decided to leave about 10,000 British soldiers in the American colonies. It did this for two reasons. One was that there weren't enough jobs for people back home in England. The other reason is that the Potomac Rebellion showed that the colonists still needed help defending themselves from American Indian attacks. The leaders of Great Britain decided that they needed to tax the colonies, both to pay the cost of the war and to pay for the troops stationed there. This decision to tax the colonies, however, would be very unpopular. Page 17, the Stamp Act. In 1765, the British Parliament passed a law that required many printed materials in the colonies to be produced on stamped paper made in London. This meant a tax on everything from newspapers to playing cards. It was against the law to use paper that did not contain the stamp. Many American colonists were against the Stamp Act. In Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the men who had been put in charge of collecting the tax were hung in effigy. In Maryland, a crowd staged a funeral for the Stamp Act. Meanwhile, a group of men from several different colonies who were against the Stamp Act began sending letters to each other. They called themselves the Sons of Liberty. Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and Paul Revere, all of whom would play an important role in the American Revolution, were among the original Sons of Liberty. Many of the letters that these men wrote were distributed to other people. For the first time, people who lived in one colony were openly discussing their frustrations with the British government with people from another colony. The people who spoke against the Stamp Act and other taxes like it pointed out that the colonies had no representatives in the Parliament. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," summed this up, and many of the speeches and articles opposed to taxes such as the Stamp Act included it. Townshend Acts. Less than a year after passing the Stamp Act, the British Parliament repealed it. However, in 1767, Parliament passed a series of laws named the Townshend Act. The Townshend Acts placed taxes on glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea, none of which were produced in the colonies at that time and had to be imported from Britain. The Townshend Act were just as unpopular as the Stamp Act had been. Opposition was greatest in the coastal cities such as Boston and Philadelphia. These were the cities, turn the page, that had custom houses, which is where the taxes were collected. In these cities, it was easiest to organize meetings and more possible to organize protests. It was only a matter of time before protests led to violence. In 1767, for instance, a mob of people angry about taxes attacked a group of people who worked for the British tax collectors and tarred and feathered several of them. This was a form of public humiliation and torture where the tax collectors were stripped naked and covered with pine tar and feathers. 3 years after the Townshend Acts, British soldiers were guarding the custom houses in Boston. It was cold and there was snow on the ground. Some angry colonists began yelling at the soldiers and throwing ice and snowballs at them. The crowd got larger and more soldiers arrived. The soldiers fired on the crowd, killing 5 people and wounding 6 others. 4 of the 5 people killed were white. One of them was a free Black man named Crispus Attucks, who was African and Native American descent. Today, we know this as the Boston Massacre.